Jumping back in with some Battletech Tactica here, focusing on the new players, making our way through the rules and, of course, the various mechs and scenarios. You come to the weapons profilers. You understand modifiers. You understand range. But we see with certain weapons like the PPC, this idea of minimums. So what does that mean? How does it make sense? And where the heck did it even come from? So we see this idea where you have modifiers in Battletech. You're trying to come up with that magic number that you need to hit. You take into account the range, and then you take into account how many hexes the target has moved, and you take into account if you're standing still, walking, running, jumping. You put those all into the matrix, and you come up with what you need. What we see with long-range missiles and PPCs is that at a certain range, it adds numbers onto it. So you've got like short range, but then you've got these other modifiers. If you are under the minimum, you add to that. So what's the point of that? And what's the balance from that? Well, in the narrative, it kind of explains it where PPCs produce these massive amounts of electrical force. And at close ranges, it needs time to accelerate, and it can possibly damage the targeting systems, possibly damage your mech firing it. So you kind of need to override things, and it's not as effective with how it operates. It's kind of dangerous with how it operates. Likewise, with long-range missiles, the idea is they need time to spread out on the area that they hit. They need time to kind of accelerate, to lock onto a target. They're not as accurate. I think that's narrative to, if we're talking inner sphere, pre-clans, because at its inception, Battletech was Star League and Inner Sphere. Now, as it evolved over time, you've got clans, you've got Dark Age, you've got all this other stuff. But the tech at the time, to balance things out, PPCs were some of the most powerful weapons in the game. They had range. They hit you for 10 points of damage. They did a lot of heat. They had no ammo. Yeah, autocannon 20 is boss mode, but you've got ammo. And you got to get super close point blank. And in theory, I mean, I know you're not hitting the same area, but a mech with two PPCs can put out potentially the same damage output as one autocannon 20. So you need something to kind of offset that. And likewise, certain mechs like the longbow or the archer, and we've studied the longbow. We've explored longbow and archer tactica, pushing that up to the Battletech playlist. Inner Sphere long-range missiles pack a tremendous punch. They've got a big spread. I mean, imagine an LRM 15 or a 20. Side note, that's what makes the Valkyrie very interesting. You're packing that LRM 10-pack on a light mech that somehow is still fast and packs a primary medium laser and can jump around and do stuff. It can really push out a lot tactically. I love the Valkyrie. So within that framework, long-range missiles, they need something to offset. So I think that's why they cooked up this narrative to have these minimum ranges and have them work in. Now, tactically, it's something to keep in mind, but it depends a lot on the mech, on the machine. If you're fighting in a Warhammer, and I say the Warhammer because it's a good example, it's a mech that I regularly play. You've got those PPCs, and now as your opponent begins to close, you've got lasers, you've got short-range missiles, point blank, you've got machine guns, or depending on the variant, small lasers. You've got other weapons that at some point you can drop off that PPC and still put damage output against it. Likewise, the Marauder. The Marauder is going to be pushing out with those PPCs, but then at a certain point, you probably stop firing them as you get to medium, as you get to really short range, and you're going to go with the medium lasers and that autocannon to see what you can do. But if you have a mech that doesn't have other weapons to complement, then how do you deal with that? How do you handle that? There's also a question of sometimes, even if you're playing a Warhammer or a mech with a PPC, it's 10 points of damage. You know, if I'm playing a Battlemaster, that's 10 points of damage. So if I can get to point blank range and park myself so I don't have any modifiers, walking, running, and maybe we're city fight, city tech, or something's happened where you're not necessarily moving, if I can tactically position you and cut down on your movement modifiers, sometimes we suddenly see that those minimum modifiers, they're manageable. They're doable. Yes, I would like them not to exist, but they exist. So it's not like they've got them, I'll never take them, I'll never utilize them. There's also times where you either are forced to fire them. My mech's smoking, my arm's blown off, heat's through the roof. I'm probably not going to last another turn. Maybe, maybe not. I'm firing everything I got. Or in the case where if you have a machine with serious heat management, like the Awesome, you will fire it. You know, the great example was, and an Awesome is also literally an awesome mech, you're going to be firing one or two of those PPCs no matter what the range every turn, because you have the heat to deal with it. You've got the mass to deal with it. You've also got the locations. Another great example is the Banshee. The Banshee wants to get up there and punch and do physical attacks. So it has those primary weapons in the torso. I'm going to fire that PPC at point blank range. Yeah, I might need high numbers to hit, but I've got the heat management to make it possible. It's a free shot, and I can still make my physical attacks. Now, if I've got the PPC in the arm, maybe I won't do that. We need to look. Sometimes you can still fire it. Obviously, I want to dance, float, be at that range where I don't have the minimums, but it's not as crippling. Likewise, what we sometimes see also with the Archer and the Longbow with that LRM-20, we will fire them at point blank range. You will take that shot, but it is something tactically to consider, tactically looking at heat, your chances to hit, what else is going to happen, usually asking yourself, it is a dice-based game, anything can happen as a mech warrior, as a mech commander, but looking 2 or 3 turns ahead and saying to yourself, if I fire now, what's that going to look like? If I fire now, how could that potentially work out? And making that decision. But putting it out there to my fellow longtime Battletech players, why the minimums anyway? I mean, it's a rule-based system. You could not have the minimums and maybe just increase the tonnage to offset it. But again, I really think the minimums, the narrative explains it. But I think that if we're looking at classic Battletech, Innersphere, pre-clans, that tech doesn't exist. The balance, the reason for these weapons that they can do such an amazing amount of damage at long range, there needed to be something, some weakness injected in, or some possible exploit injected in, that a player that doesn't have those can possibly close and get in and counter, especially if you're playing as intended on the traditional hex maps where you are limited to that hex map. You can't leave that hex map. So long-range firepower, while it's powerful, you can close very quickly and get into short range. There needs to be some sort of offset. That's just my opinion on it, your opinion on it, but certainly as a mech commander and a mech warrior, understanding those minimums and knowing when to push it, knowing when to play conservative, and again, trying to project out 2 or 3 turns and ask that question, what is going to possibly happen next?